One of the easiest and fastest ways you can improve your iPhone photos is by mastering composition. And composition is so critical, I really cannot stress it enough. You could be standing in front of the most beautiful view in the world, but if you don't compose it correctly, it's not going to work out. You will not get a good photo. Composition is that big of a deal. And while composition can seem a little bit difficult, it is relatively easy to master if you follow some proven composition techniques and guidelines. I'm going to share with you my 7 favorite composition techniques that I use all the time to capture the best iPhone photos possible. Again, these aren't composition rules, they're composition tools, so feel free to use them if they work for that particular photo, but you don't have to use them all the time. However, if you know these composition techniques, they'll make a big difference when you're out there on your own looking for photo opportunities, because you'll already know what to look for. All right, let's get started. Now, the first composition technique I have for you is really simple, and that's simplicity. Now, I'm not kidding. It is actually a really important rule or principle in composition that you want to keep your photos as simple as possible. The world around us is really cluttered. There are all these things that are just kind of scattered about, and for the most part, that doesn't look so good in your frame. So as a photographer, try to get in the habit of looking for the simplest possible scene you can find, and then on top of that, try to frame that photo in such a way where you only capture the essence of that image. Anything that doesn't belong there has to go out of the frame. Let me show you an example. So here I've framed up this beautiful oak tree in the middle of grain field. Now you'll immediately notice that I have a bit of a problem at the bottom, so that is actually my own shadow. I know I don't want that. So I'm going to reframe the shot so that the shadow goes out. And now look at this. It is as simple as a shot could possibly get. All we have here is a single oak tree in the middle of this huge field, and that actually looks really good. Now, it is a regular tree. There's nothing special about it. It's not too big, it's not too unusual, it's just a regular tree. But because I framed this tree in such a simple composition, and because I've eliminated all possible distractions, all I have left is a simple, beautiful image. Now, Steve Jobs had the saying that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, and I think he was onto something. So if you look at the design of any Apple product, it's all about simplicity. Anything that's not needed has been removed from the design, so all you have left is the true essence of the product. In photography, it's kind of the same. Always try to simplify the scene as much as you can, and more often than not, those simple images will work really well. Now, the next composition technique I'd like to share with you is kind of related to simplicity, and that is using negative space in your photos. So what is negative space? Well, the easiest way to think about it is that it's everything that's not your subject. So if I'm taking a photo of a tree, everything that's not that tree is negative space. However, typically it's the part of the frame that is essentially not filled with anything. So it could be filled with blue sky or perhaps with water, but negative space is a part of the frame where nothing's going on. Now, why would nothing be a good thing in composition? Let me show you. Now, we're still looking at that same shot I just captured before, but let me show you what happens if I switch over to my 0.5x, my ultra wide. Now, once again, my shadow is in the frame, so I have to be careful about that. But take a look at this. If I reframe the shot in such a way where all we have is this closest oak tree and then that other oak tree more in the distance, I can create something really interesting and it looks kind of cool. But look at the top half of the image. There's literally nothing there, just blue sky. Actually, that blue sky takes up perhaps 70 or 80% of the frame. Now, normally, I wouldn't like that because I'm responsible for everything in that frame. However, there are times when I can compose the shot in such a way where I leave as much negative space as possible. And here's the great irony about negative space. The more negative space you have around your subject, the more your subject will get emphasized. So the more I move my iPhone up, the more those trees start to stand out. However, there is obviously a limit. So if I go too far, then I no longer have that field in the foreground. And that field to me is an important part of the frame. it kind of grounds the image. It tells the viewer where I'm standing, that we're standing in this beautiful sunlit field, and that this is where we have those oak trees. So I don't want to leave too much of the field because I want all that negative space at the top, but I still need to leave just a little bit so that it looks pleasing to the eye. I think this is roughly the framing I'm interested in, so I'll go ahead and take a photo. Now, if you look at this image, I think it really turned out interesting. You'll notice that most of that image is actually empty. We have so much negative space above the trees, and yet those trees stand out even more because we have all that negative space. And in general, negative space can be a really powerful tool in composition. It goes hand in hand with simplicity, because the more negative space you have, the simpler your image will be. I recommend that you practice both of these composition guidelines. If you do so, your images will definitely get better. A lot of composition guidelines tell you where to position your subject if you only really have one important subject in the frame. But what do you do if you have more than one things that are really prominent in the frame? What's the best way to compose a shot like that? Well, oftentimes the best thing you can do is place these subjects diagonally from each other. Let me show you what I mean. So we're still looking at the same beautiful oak tree, but now I'm looking at it from a different vantage point, and you'll immediately notice that here we have two things of interest. So we have the oak tree itself, and then we have this beautiful road that's extending into the distance. But look at how these subjects have been arranged in the frame. You'll see that the oak tree is at the top left-hand corner, while the road is at the bottom right. And that is not an accident. If you have two subjects that you want to align in the frame, often the best way to do that is to align them diagonally. This has one really important benefit. You will be able to frame the shot in such a way where you're using most of the space in the shot. In other words, if I frame the shot using the diagonal principle, you'll see that I have some strong interest on the left-hand side of the frame. I have the tree. And I have some strong interest on the right, which is the road. I also have some strong interest at the top section of the frame, which is once again the tree. And at the bottom, I also have interest, which is the road. So this way, I'm essentially using most of that frame. So this is almost the opposite of the negative space guideline. When you're shooting photos with negative space, you're intentionally leaving large sections of your frame blank to draw more attention to your subject. Well, here I'm kind of doing the opposite. I'm trying to fill the entire frame with interest, and if I'm working with two subjects, the best way to do that is to align them diagonally in the frame. If you frame your shots like this, you'll often get some really interesting and really powerful compositions. Next, let's talk about symmetry. Now, symmetry is perhaps one of the most powerful composition guidelines of all. When you have the right kind of scene to frame up a symmetrical shot, that always looks spectacular. Let me show you what I mean. Now, I'm still standing at the same location. I'm still next to this oak tree. We're now at the peak of the golden hour. This is the best light we'll have for the entire day. And I don't think it's going to get better after this point because the golden hour is almost over. So I will stop talking and I'll show you how symmetry works in composition. Now you'll notice that I have this road going through my frame from the foreground all the way into the background. And I framed up this shot in such a way where the road is perfectly symmetrical. And that is not an accident. If I just move a tiny bit to the left, you'll immediately see that I've lost that symmetry and it no longer looks the same. So the trick to getting a symmetrical composition is standing exactly in the middle. So if I'm taking a photo of the road, I want to be standing exactly in the center of that road. If I was taking a photo of a building, I would be standing exactly in the center of that building. This is important. If you're using symmetry in your shots, you want to get it exactly right. If you get it kind of right, that's not good enough. That's not a symmetrical shot. So I'm going to adjust my frame to make sure that I get that symmetry exactly right. And you'll also notice that I'm using the top grid line as my horizon line. So above the top grid line, I have the blue sky. Below that, I have the road. Now, take a look at what would happen if I didn't have that road at all. If all I had was just this field, you'll immediately see that the image is not working at all. There's nothing to catch the interest of the viewer. all we have is essentially two colors. So that doesn't work. But because we have this road and because we have that symmetry, I can actually capture a beautiful photo. So before I press the shutter, I'll experiment with different heights, and you'll see that as I go lower, I kind of start to lose that road. It is now coming in from the sides of the image, so I don't want that. As I go higher, actually the road becomes more prominent. And for this specific image, since it's all about that road, I have to be just a little higher than normal. So I think this height works really well, and it really amplifies that road. So now that I'm happy with the framing, I'll go ahead and press the shutter. And look at that. Even though this composition is so simple, it's also extremely powerful. We have these really strong lines, these strong leading lines, leading the eye all the way into the distance, and the shot is perfectly symmetrical, which looks really, really good. But let me quickly show you what happens if I switch to my 0.5x, my ultra-wide lens. Look at what happens to the foreground. As I switched from 1x to 0.5x, that foreground got bigger and more prominent, so now I'm seeing all that grain even better. And number two, the road got even longer. So even though I'm taking the same shot and the composition is kind of the same, what's not the same is how the foreground relates to the background. Now I think that 0.5x actually looks really interesting, and I'm really happy to include those sunlit grains in the foreground. So I think it's just another detail that makes this photo even stronger. So let me carefully adjust my framing to make sure I get that symmetry exactly right. And once I'm there, I'll go ahead and press the shutter. And this is how you can use symmetry to greatly improve the composition of your iPhone photos. It doesn't always work. You can't use it in every scene, but when you have something that's already symmetrical, going for symmetry will often be the most powerful composition you can possibly use. The next composition technique I absolutely love to use is called leading lines. Leading lines are any strong lines that a viewer is going to notice when they're looking at your images. Some of the best leading lines come from the foreground of the image, and they lead the eye of the viewer towards the background, or even better, towards your main subject. Let me show you an example. Right now, you'll see that I'm standing on this wooden pathway that goes through a lake, and it's a really interesting, really unique place. And you'll notice that I have a strong line, or I should say a set of strong lines, going from the foreground all the way to the background. So those are leading lines. But you'll also notice that I have these hand railings on both sides of me, and watch what happens if I start to get lower. You'll see that those hand railings start to become more and more prominent, and at some point I can frame the shot in such a way where I have really strong lines originating from all the corners of the image. And that looks absolutely stunning. Now, to make sure that this is exposed properly, I'll quickly lock exposure on the sky. And now I'm going to make some final adjustments to the framing. I want to be really careful to frame this in such a way where those lines at the top are originating exactly from the corner. And with leading lines in general, it's a good idea to have them originate from the corner of your image. It's not always possible, but if you have a strong line that's close to the corner of the frame, make sure it comes out exactly from the corner. So now that I'm happy with the framing, I'll go ahead and take a photo. And look at that. I'm really happy with how this turned out, but I think I could further improve this image if there was a person in the frame, because then all those lines would be leading towards that person. Now I know that every now and then someone walks by here, so if I just wait for a moment, I think I could get an even better shot. Okay, I can see that someone's coming from behind me, so I'll let that person pass. And once they're past me, I'll make sure I take some photos. Okay, I'll quickly get in position. I'll take a whole bunch of photos. Just a few more to be sure I get the right shot. And now look at that. That is absolutely stunning. I have this really strong composition with strong leading lines coming in from all the corners of the image, and they all lead towards my main subject. This is such a powerful composition. Another great composition technique I like to use is repetition. And this tends to work really well when you're shooting man-made objects. For example, if you're taking photos of architecture, let me show you how you can use repetition in your photos. So right now you can see that I'm standing on this little street in the old town of a small Latvian town, and here on the left I have this beautiful old building. And what really attracted me to this building were those windows on the top floor. So you'll see that these windows have these structures that kind of come out of the roof, and we have 5 of them. And to me, that shows the potential for a really strong composition. So I want to make the shot all about those windows on the top floor. So how can I do this? I'm going to start by switching to my 2x, my telephoto lens. And you'll see the 2 things are happening. 1, I'm much closer to the building, and I've kind of eliminated everything else that's not the building. And 2, now the building is compressed together. Since I'm using the 2x, the end of the building now appears closer to me because of how compression works. So I'm quite happy with this 2x view, but I think I can improve this framing even more. And normally I like to say that composition is a game of inches. Well, here we're not talking inches, we're talking millimeters, because I want to be sure that I include everything that I want to include in the frame, and everything that's not relevant has to go out. So one thing that's really going to improve this photo is if I don't show the end of the building. And this is kind of counterintuitive, but if you have a long building like this with a lot of repetition, if I don't show the very end of the building, you get this sense of a never-ending building. So because I don't show where the building ends, that leaves room to the imagination to kind of draw this building out even further. And in the photo, it looks like the building never ends. So that's a really great technique when you're dealing with a composition like this. I also want to make sure I leave just a little bit of room around that door on the left-hand side, but I can't leave too much space there because there's this chimney at the top left, and I want to make sure that that chimney is not in the composition. So once I've adjusted the framing carefully, I'll go ahead and press the shutter. Now I'm really happy with the shot we just captured. I think it manages to show the repetition really, really well. But you'll also notice we have these really strong leading lines leading from left to right, and all these lines kind of converge on the right-hand side of the frame. And if those lines led to a subject, that would be even better. So I'll wait here for a moment until someone comes along, and hopefully that way I can take an even better photo. All right, I can see a bicycle coming, so I'll quickly grab some photos and look at that. Exactly where I wanted, we have this beautiful bicycle, and all these strong leading lines that we have in the frame are pointing directly at the cyclist. It's a really strong composition with both repetition and leading lines. And finally, the last composition technique I want to share with you is simply filling the frame with the thing you're taking a photo of. This works particularly well if you have a strong texture or a pattern. I'm standing in front of this old green wooden wall, and the paint is peeling off, so it hasn't been painted for a long time. And for me as a photographer, that gives a great opportunity to capture interesting textures. Let me show you. If I open up the camera app, you'll see the wall I'm standing next to. And the first thing I'm going to do is switch to my 2x telephoto lens. If you're shooting close-up details like this, I recommend using the 2x lens if you have that available. Now you'll see that with the telephoto lens, I'm actually so close to the wall that I no longer see the building, I no longer see the individual planks that make up the building. All I see is texture and patterns. And on this wall, literally without moving my feet at all, I could probably find dozens of unique texture photos. Let me show you. Now this is already an abstract pattern, but I think I can make it more interesting if I get even closer. So as I get closer and closer, you'll see this paint really start to stand out. So I'm going to go ahead and take a photo right here. And now, let's move on to the next plank. So literally right above that, I have an entirely different texture. This looks like little cubes, and it's really, really interesting. So once again, I'm just gonna move my iPhone around for a bit until I find what I think will make a good composition, and I'll go ahead and take another shot. As the last example, I'll go all the way up, and right here, we have another really unique opportunity. So here, if I'm taking this shot, actually at the top right-hand corner where the grid lines intersect, you'll see I have a bit of an opening in the paint, and that kind of becomes my subject almost. So I'm gonna use the rule of thirds to frame this up, and I'll take another photo. Now, as you can see, I could probably spend all day in front of this wall, and honestly, I would not run out of unique photo opportunities. There are literally so many different patterns you can find here. But the point I'm trying to make is about composition. So if you are taking a pattern or a texture shot, simply fill the entire frame with nothing but a pattern or texture. You want to take it out of context, so you don't want to take a photo of the building, you don't even want to take a photo of the plank, you just want to take a photo of the pattern. If you fill the entire frame with the pattern, that way you can create a really strong, really unique photo. Now, I just shared with you my favorite composition techniques for taking beautiful photos with the iPhone. Please understand that these composition techniques are not composition rules. Instead, these are composition tools. You can use these tools if you want to, but you don't have to use them in every photo. In fact, there's no way you could use all these tools in the same photo. It's just not possible. But the more tools you know and the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more you'll start to recognize photo opportunities around you. So practice using these techniques, and over time, they'll start to feel natural to you, and you'll start to recognize opportunities to use them more and more. And as a result, you'll be able to take incredible iPhone photos even more often. This video was a free preview of my iPhone Photo Academy online course. In this course, you'll discover everything you need to know to take stunning photos with your iPhone. So if you'd like to take the kind of photos that will leave your friends and family speechless, please take a look at the full version of iPhone Photo Academy. You'll find a link in the description right next to this video, so click on that link right now, and I'll see you inside the full version of the course.